As tensions between the US and Iran escalate once more, we ask, do Iran's leaders have a plan for what comes next? And why did Israel's apparent attempt to replace them fail so spectacularly? But first, the headlines. Strikes between the US and Iran have continued throughout the week in what is the latest and most severe round of escalation between the two parties since the April ceasefire. After reimposing its blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, the US launched its latest wave of strikes early on Thursday, hitting areas around Tehran and the country's southeast. Tehran accused the US of carrying out a barbaric attack after a cancer hospital in southwest Iran was evacuated due to nearby strikes. Iranian authorities claim that the latest round of attacks have killed over 35 people and wounded more than 300 others across Iran. In response, Iran carried out another round of strikes on Thursday against Bahrain, Kuwait and Jordan, all of which have been frequent targets of Iranian retaliation in recent days. Threats between the two have also escalated rhetorically. After President Trump threatened to strike Iran's power plants and bridges, Iran said that if the US hits civilian sites, all the infrastructure in the region will be crushed, adding that the Houthis would close the Bab el-Mandeb waterway should the US attack its power grid. The waterway's closure would seal off the other main route out of the region for seaborne energy exports, threatening to plunge the world economy into an even graver energy crisis. US President Trump has reportedly told Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu that Israel should begin redeploying forces out of Syria and eventually out of Lebanon too, according to senior US and Israeli officials speaking to the news outlet Axios. In a phone call between the two leaders last week, Trump warned the Israeli premier that they don't want you there, referring to recent tensions between Syrian residents and occupying Israeli forces in the country's south. Now, debates over military strategy are not limited to American officials. As the country enters another round of conflict with the US, Iran's leaders are also debating how best to use the leverage gained over the Strait of Hormuz during the war. Now, here to explain how Iran's leadership is looking at the next stage of confrontation and whether they have a plan for what comes afterward is senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and founding director of its Iran program, Alex Vatanka. Alex, welcome back to MEE Live. It's a pleasure to have you on again. I want to begin by asking you about the recent round of escalation we've seen lately. Now, some observers have accused Iran of overplaying its hand in the Strait of Hormuz, given its insistence on total control over the waterway. Do you see that insistence as hurting diplomacy or seeking greater insurance while approaching it?
Look, it's great to be with you. I think, it comes down to, I guess, Iranian readings of the overall situation, the cards that they have, then the cards that they don't have. They feel that the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's de facto control over that waterway is their biggest card today. If you go back to 17th of June, when Iran and the United States signed that memorandum of understanding, the Iranians were so keen on one of those 14 points, which was basically their reading. And again, this can be just their reading, and the Americans might have read it differently. But the Iranians read it as Strait of Hormuz being under Iranian sovereignty. Within a week, the Iranians could see that the U.S. Navy, together with the Omanis, had created a southern corridor that was, creating a maritime route in and out without asking for Iranian permission. And that's why the Revolutionary Guard started taking shots at some of the ships. So the Iranians felt that the MOU was being questioned from get-go, and that's why this, the ceasefire has been fragile from the very moment it was signed. Now, the bigger question is this: do the Iranians insist on this control of the Strait of Hormuz forever and ever, or are they just hanging on to it as a card before they walk into that negotiations with the Americans, where all sorts of files need to be discussed? You would hope, to a point about what's going on in Tehran, that those voices in the Iranian regime who are saying, look, it's great that we have the control of the strait, but at some point it's a card we either play or we burn it. So then let's not burn it. Play the card when it's the opportune moment to play it. Get concessions from the other side on whether it's on the nuclear issue, whether it's on sanctions relief, but play the card. Let's go back to the Strait of Hormuz being like it was before the war broke out on the 28th of February. And that's how they see it. Very quickly, the opposite end of the spectrum here, they call it giving away a diamond being the Strait of Hormuz, for a lollipop, which is worthless. They're saying, why would you do that? You are effectively controlling the Gulf region now. Why would you even consider giving away the control that Iran effectively has today? So there's that debate. But I will very quickly again point out those people who are willing to, have this symbolic control over the strait recognized, but essentially let life go back to normal. They seem to be in the driver's seat in Tehran, even as this war right now is raging on again.
So you think that those who would settle for a symbolic recognition of sovereignty, but still eventually trade that card in, you say those are in the driver's seat. And I'm interested how you think the balance of power sits currently in Tehran. We saw a lengthy statement from, the official leading the negotiations, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, yesterday, in which he said that, if the MOU doesn't provide anything, if we don't benefit from it, we have no reason to adhere to it, and that our security essentially depends on maintaining Iranian arrangements in Hormuz. I wonder what you made of his statement and where you think he stands in this process.
Look, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf is very significant. He's, as you pointed out, the lead negotiator, but he's also someone who comes with sort of very deep pedigree of having been involved in the Islamic Republic since he was a very young man, essentially a teenager, going back to 1979. He has been a presidential candidate, a long time, still is Speaker of the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, failed a few times running for the presidency, but nonetheless, he was a presidential candidate. So he isn't just a marginal figure. And I would assume that Ghalibaf represents a good, if not the consensus, a good portion of what's the Revolutionary Guards, essentially the entity that runs Iran today. I don't think we should get confused about who runs Iran today. It's not Masoud Pezeshkian, the president. It's not the like of Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. It's the Revolutionary Guards with a couple of other important networks of interest groups that are essentially, taking this regime forward. And Ghalibafs of this world are out there repeatedly making the point that this is an existential war. Yes, that you should fight the Americans, you should retaliate, you should not give in to Donald Trump's demands. But as you pointed out, they're still saying the MOU, yes, it hasn't been perfect, it hasn't worked out, but if there's a way to salvage what's left of it, if you can go back, then that should be the course of action Iran should take. And as I said, these are the ones who are in the driver's seat today. And that's why they are the most important voices from Tehran to listen to. And the opposite end here in Washington, where I'm speaking to you from, you got the likes of Vice President J.D. Vance, who are saying there is no military solution to this conflict. You got to look for the diplomatic way out. So if these two groups, pro-diplomacy folks in Washington, pro-diplomacy folks in Tehran, if they can find a way to build enough confidence to go back, maybe get the Pakistanis, the Omanis, the Qataris, to sort of create a pathway forward, as hard as it will be, but nonetheless, that could just prevent us from, again, taking a step away from the brink of more escalation, which is not in the interest of anybody.
And I wonder how you view those, as you mentioned, those various different camps that, have varying levels of belief in this diplomatic process. Usually brokering between these factions might be the role of, say, the supreme leader, given it's the highest office in the Islamic Republic. You wrote a really excellent piece lately in Al Majalla about kind of these various different factions and kind of the absence of a meaningful position in the leader's office. Do you think that the relative absence of Mujtaba Khamenei, the former supreme leader's son, is kind of exacerbating some of these disagreements in how best to proceed, in the absence of a clear directive?
Yeah, no, that's a really important topic you just raised there. Number one, I would just very quickly point out the folks who I believe, my analysis, watching this space every day for the last 20-some years, the folks who are in the driver's seat have the numbers on their side. So those loud ones who are talking the talk of, fighting the Americans to the last American soldier has left the Middle East, they're in a minority. They're loud, but in a tiny minority. So they don't really, we're not talking of equals here. And so to your point about somebody coming in and brokering between these interest groups, there's no really need for brokering at this point because the hard line is already being driven out. Just look at this last week. A couple of very loud vocal critics of the diplomatic approach were sidelined in the parliament, the Majlis's National and Foreign Policy Committee. Really interesting. The folks who replaced them are pro-Ghaliva, pro-diplomacy folks. So already you're seeing the pro-diplomacy camp, if you will, consolidating and marginalizing those who are basically just throwing stone at this process without having a credible alternative to offer other than endless war, which nobody in Iran really wants. But to your bigger point about Mojtaba Khamenei, look, we don't know what is going on. We don't know if he's alive. We don't know his state of mind, his mental, physical. We really don't know. The point about that article that I wrote in Al Majalla is to say, yes, he might get away with that for a few days, for a few weeks. But the Islamic Republic is not, this is not the Taliban of the 1990s where Mullah Omar can hide in a cave somewhere and nobody ever saw him till he was dead. Mojtaba, if he wants to be anything like his father, needs to come out. He needs to come in from the shadows. He needs to speak, particularly when the day comes where somebody might have to broker between the various sort of competing factions in the Islamic Republic. But really important to point out, that's not what we have right now. The consensus in the Islamic Republic is to go for diplomacy if they can get something that diplomatically is worthwhile pursuing. Otherwise, the consensus would be they take their chances and have another round of war with America.
Yeah, I mean, on your note about leaning towards diplomacy, we did see, I believe it was yesterday evening, the release of a U.S. citizen that had been detained in Iran for 2 years. So that does seem to have been a goodwill gesture by the Iranians, for which President Trump thanked them. However, the U.S. president seems to be, once again, toying with any scale of destruction from civilian sites to, again, various islands around Hormuz and Pickaxe Mountain and so on. So do you think in the U.S., in foreign policy circles, there remains this kind of belief that if they could just find the one silver bullet operationally, they can finally break the gridlock in negotiations, at which point, presumably the two countries would return to war, because we're already kind of inching there with the blockade and the regular strikes and so on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Look, let me just echo or repeat what Vice President Vance just said. There is no silver bullet. There is no one quick solution to this. If you really genuinely want to control the Strait of Hormuz, the way President Trump says he would, he needs to occupy Iraq. He needs to literally go in with hundreds and thousands of American troops, occupy a country 3 times the size of France, and that would be the rest of his presidency. And we all know there is zero appetite, including the Republican Party, for that kind of a war. So President Trump right now is frustrated. That much we can tell. He's frustrated. He engages in dramatic gestures and announcements. I'm going to take the Khark Island. I'm going to do this and that. Well, that is what he's done in the past. How do the Iranians read that? They read that as American frustration. They don't think he's going to occupy Iran. And that's why the Iranians are holding back. But here's the thing that Iran has to watch out for. They're holding back at a very heavy price for themselves. So quickly, the better way forward, if I was Iran, is to start indicating that you're actually willing to cut a deal with the Americans on the Strait of Hormuz, which actually, despite what the headlines might tell you, should be pretty straightforward because it wasn't a problem just a few weeks ago. So it is a problem today, but it can be solved. But then if you're Iran, you need to indicate a willingness to go much deeper in that normalization with the Americans, because that would get Trump's attention. Then he can start really saying this is different than JCPOA. JCPOA was a very limited nuclear, essentially agreement, whereas I've opened up the Iranian regime to come to their senses and drop the anti-American stuff. Not an easy thing to do, but that's exactly kind of step the Iranians could take to shake things up here in Washington when it comes to the debate of should we go to war or should we try and cut a deal with this Islamic Republic, which frankly, vast majority of Americans find a terrible entity for its human rights record and all sorts of bad things it's done to its own people. But nonetheless, Americans, by and large, don't want to go to this new Middle Eastern venture because nobody can see anything much good come out of it.
I wonder, though, it's a question, and I guess this is going back to my earlier comment, whether you believe Ghalibaf and those in favor of diplomacy have the political capital, the requisite political capital, and will continue to do so if, these rounds of strikes continue, to pursue a far-reaching agreement with the U.S. and to really break from, 47 essentially years of tradition in doing so. Do you think that they are ready to embark on such a wholesale change coming out of this war?
So look, a couple of things. Number one, if they do so, this is a country of Iran where vast majority of Iranians, vast majority of it, probably 90% plus, if I had to guess, would be in favor of normalization of some sort with the Americans, because that's the only way you can sort of bring about stability and normality to Iran when it's in its state of their economy by having the sanctions lifted or preventing war, as we're seeing right now. So Iranians want that. That in itself is a huge mandate for the likes of Ghalibaf. And by the way, Ali Khamenei, who for 37 years was essentially the biggest obstacle to normalization with Washington, is gone. He's no longer with us. And his son is not in a position to be an obstacle. And those anti-American voices who want to fight the Americans forever and ever for the purity of their ideology, they just don't have the numbers on their side. The question really is, can the likes of Ghalibaf and the Americans find that area where they can meet and cut a deal that works for both sides? Some of the language you hear from Washington and Tehran today is nothing but posturing. The Iranians want the Americans out of the Middle East. It's not going to happen. The Americans want Iran to give up their nuclear program, their missile program, control of the Strait. It's not going to happen. So if you actually come down to some kind of a decision where you meet one another halfway, then maybe, and it's a maybe, because it will be a big fight in Tehran. For Islamic Republic that has been the last 50 years almost sort of saying everything evil in this world is about America, for them to walk that back will not be something you can do overnight. But it could be a process that can start right now. And that's exactly the window of opportunity this war has created. You don't have to love the Americans if you're the Islamic Republic, but you have to accept that war has now broken out. Death to America is no longer just a slogan, it's actually going to cost you. The question is, does the survival of the Islamic Republic, which is the most important objective this regime has, does that require them to make some adjustments when it comes to their attitude to the United States? If they do that, they will save themselves and they give Trump a break so he doesn't have to double down and go deeper into a conflict he really doesn't want to have.
Alex Vatanka, thank you so much for your insights and your time. It's such a pleasure to hear from you as always, and hopefully we'll be hearing from you again soon. Thank you.